Monsters are hunting Bigfoots on the Appalachian Trail, and what they are doing to them is unlike anything I've documented in all of my life. What this footage shows is the terrifying possibility that something even stronger than Bigfoot has been living in our forests all along. I'm Trevor. I've spent years in terrain that most people never reach, long enough to know when a corridor is working, and long enough to know when something has broken it. The corridor had been extraordinary before any of this. 40 miles of mid-Atlantic backcountry, 14 cameras at the natural choke points, and 10 weeks of weekly Bigfoot hits on the eastern ridge that were unlike anything in my prior documentation. The standout clip was a figure moving through dense brush at 30 feet, 7.5 to 8 feet tall, stride long and completely unhurried, passing through lower vegetation without disturbing a single branch below chest height. Something that size in that density of cover, leaving nothing below it disturbed. It moves like something that has never once encountered a threat it couldn't simply be larger than. That is what was living in this corridor before the hunters arrived. The first sign wasn't a new animal on camera, it was a behavior change in one already there. Eastern Ridge Camera, Week 10, last confirmed Bigfoot hit on this grid. The stride is shorter than every prior clip on that camera. The cadence is faster. That loose, unhurried quality is gone, replaced by something tight and deliberate. The movement of an animal that has already processed a threat and is executing a response to it. This Bigfoot had registered something days before any of my cameras picked up a single frame of what was causing it. 4 days after that clip, the hunters appeared. From that point forward, the eastern ridge was silent. 10 weeks of consistent hits, erased in 4 days. By the time my cameras caught the first frame of what was doing it, the Bigfoots had already been running. What I remember about that hike in order to pull the first cards is the quiet, not the comfortable quiet of low wind and still air, a different kind entirely. No squirrel movement in the canopy, no woodpecker work on the dead timber along the ridge. My own footfall was the loudest thing out there, which in terrain this dense is not how it's supposed to feel. I've walked into forests after large predator activity before, and there's a signature to it. A collective stillness, like everything breathing in and forgetting to breathe back out. This felt like that, except spread across miles rather than yards. Walking through that silence toward my first camera pull, I had the uncomfortable sense that whatever had caused it wasn't finished, that it was still out there, further south, and the silence around me was the evidence of everything it had already passed through on its way there. The first hunter hit came through at just before 2 in the morning, wide through, the chest and shoulders in a way that registered before anything else. The kind of build that pushes against the edges of the shot in a way that feels wrong before you've consciously identified why. Moving south, fast, and completely straight. No deviation toward any scent marker. No engagement with food sources I knew from 10 weeks of monitoring were actively used in this area. No acknowledgement of anything that wasn't directly on its heading. An animal moving through territory engages with it. An animal holding a hunting heading ignores all of it. This one moved through 10 weeks of documented wildlife activity like none of it existed. Not distracted, not unaware, simply uninterested. Because everything in this corridor that wasn't the thing it was tracking had already been categorized as irrelevant. That single behavioral detail, the complete dismissal of everything in its environment that wasn't its target, told me more about what this animal was than the size or the build did. This wasn't a predator moving through unfamiliar terrain. This was a predator executing a plan it had already made, in a corridor it had already decided belonged to it. Going back through the cards from cameras further north, I found what I had flagged as anomalous and set aside. Same build, same window between 1 and 3 in the morning, same southward heading, 3 consecutive weeks of near-nightly movement before I had understood what I was looking at. What unsettled me later was realizing that across 14 cameras and 3 weeks of footage, not once did either animal repeat the same exact foot placement through a choke point, which meant they weren't just moving through the corridor, they were actively avoiding leaving a pattern. 3 weeks. This animal had been running this corridor for 3 weeks before the Bigfoot stopped showing up on the eastern cameras. The prey had registered it before any piece of equipment I had placed in this terrain did. They were already running while I was still reviewing footage and calling it inconclusive. And sitting with that now makes the whole sequence feel different. Not a sudden disruption, but a slow, patient pressure applied from the north for weeks before anything on my cards showed its shape. The next camera south gave me the clip that changed how I read everything that followed. Just after 2 in the morning, large animal through the frame, and what hit me first wasn't the size or the build, it was the absence. Every Bigfoot I have ever captured on a trail camera has responded to the housing, slowed, turned, investigated the scent around the mount. Every single one across years of running grids in terrain like this. This animal moved through like the camera didn't exist, not because it couldn't smell it, because whatever it was tracking further south had its complete attention, and a trail camera on a tree wasn't worth the cost of a single second. I've seen focused animals before, watched predators lock onto prey and filter everything else out. But there's a threshold past which that focus stops resembling instinct and starts resembling something uncomfortably deliberate, and this clip was well past it. The indifference wasn't the indifference of a distracted animal. It was the indifference of something so completely inside a decision it had already made that the world outside that decision had ceased to be relevant input. Standing at that mount with the trees from the clip 30 yards behind me, I tried to work out what the timeline looked like from the Bigfoot's perspective. It had registered this animal weeks before my cameras did, and had been moving south in response, while I was still calling things inconclusive. The animal from the early weeks, the one that moved through dense brush without disturbing a branch, that had never needed to be afraid of anything, had spent weeks moving through its own terrain with something behind it that it couldn't outrank. That thought hasn't left me since. The camera after that gave me 2 hits on consecutive nights. Same build, same heading, and the second clip ran long enough to read the full proportions clearly for the first time. Wide through the chest and shoulders, shorter in the leg relative to the torso than a Bigfoot's proportions. Mass sitting lower and heavier, center of gravity closer to the ground than anything in my reference footage. A profile I had no analog for anywhere in years of documentation. What struck me wasn't just the size, it was the sureness. Every step placed with a precision that spoke to an animal that had run this trail many times, that had built an intimate familiarity with every dip and root and soft patch of ground across weeks of nightly use. Not an animal moving through unfamiliar terrain. An animal moving through terrain it had already decided was its own, with the ease of something that made that decision long ago and hadn't reconsidered it once. And somewhere, ahead of it on that same trail, a Bigfoot that had owned this corridor for 10 weeks was still trying to stay far enough in front of it to survive. Between the next 2 camera pulls, I found the bedding site. Compressed vegetation in a shallow depression, hair on bark at 9 feet, and again at 7.5. Weeks of accumulated disturbance from consistent return visits. The hair caught on the bark at 9 feet wasn't snagged the way it usually is when something brushes past. It had been pulled free in a single direction, the kind of mark you see when something leaves faster than it planned to. Something had been sleeping here regularly, comfortably enough to maintain a long-term rest site deep in the corridor. But the edges told a different story, not the gradual, settled character of a site vacated naturally, pushed outward fast in a single direction, the physical record of something cleared in one movement. This hadn't been abandoned. It had been evacuated, and the direction it had been evacuated in was south. The Bigfoots in this corridor hadn't just been displaced, they had been driven, and whatever drove them had been through this exact spot recently enough that the impression in the ground still held its shape. That detail pulled the hunt off the cameras and put it in the mud in front of me, and the 2 didn't feel like separate things after that. 30 yards further, tracks in soft mud at the edge of a seep. The impressions were deep enough to hold water, and the front edge of each one was blown out, the kind of distortion you see when something heavy hits soft ground without slowing. 3 partial impressions, too wide and short-toed for Bigfoot, too large and wrong-shaped for bear. Significant weight at speed, stride spacing long and pointing south, less than 200 yards between the bedding site and those impressions, both pointing the same direction as every camera hit for 3 weeks. Whatever made these tracks had been through that bedding site recently enough that the Bigfoot using it had left in a hurry. Not before the hunters arrived, but after they got close enough that staying wasn't an option. I stood up and kept moving south. Walking the last stretch of trail, it occurred to me that every animal in this forest had probably recognized these 2 weeks before any of my cameras ever did. At that point, I was following the evidence whether I was ready for what was at the end of it or not. What came back on the next camera is where the escalation became visible in the footage itself, rather than something I was reading into the pattern. Same build, same heading, but at the far edge of the frame, just before the animal moved out of shot, it slowed. The pause only lasted a second, but the way the head lifted and settled again looked less like searching and more like confirming something it already knew. Fractionally, subtle enough that it took 3 full watches to confirm it was real. It was reading the trail, dropping pace to process scent to calculate exactly how recently something had passed. An animal that slows mid-pursuit to read a trail is an animal close enough to its target that the target's recent passage has become live information. It wasn't slowing because it had lost the heading. It was slowing because the scent was fresh enough to tell it exactly how fresh. When it resumed, the pace was faster than what it had dropped from. That acceleration, subtle, automatic, the output of an animal that had just confirmed what it already suspected, is the moment the footage shifted from documenting a pursuit to documenting a closing. The gap between hunter and Bigfoot had narrowed to the point where patience was about to become unnecessary, and the clip showed the hunter responding to that the only way something like this responds to it, by pushing harder. The forest, when I pulled that card, was silent in the held breath way, not empty, loaded. Every bird and small mammal sitting still in whatever cover it had found, waiting for a signal that hadn't come yet. I've been in that kind of silence before, and it has a texture that an empty forest doesn't produce. Standing at that mount with a clip of something that had just confirmed its prey was close playing on the screen. I had one clear thought. Whatever made this forest hold its breath was still out there, and it wasn't far. The following card had a hit later than the established window, past 3 in the morning, which told me something before I even watched it. An animal that breaks from a consistent nightly schedule is responding to a development. The clip showed the hunter at a speed I had no prior reference for in any footage from this grid, fast enough that the frame rate produced motion blur at the edges of the shot. Moving that fast on a game trail in dense backcountry in complete darkness is not pursuit. It's the final stage of one, the stage where the calculation is complete. And the only remaining variable is distance. Something at the southern end of this grid had broken into a full run, and this was the response to it. 3 weeks of measured patient closure had reached its endpoint. What I was watching was what came after. The card after that had 2 hits on the same night, hours apart. The second one changed how I read everything above it on the timeline. 2 animals in the same frame, the slight variation in stride pattern I had noted across multiple prior cards visible side by side, confirming what I had suspected since the central cameras. There had always been 2 of them. The separation on the northern cameras wasn't 2 animals at different stages. It was 2 animals running the same hunt in coordinated separation, each working a different band of the corridor, the full shape of their method only becoming visible now that they had converged, moving together, consistent spacing, adjusting to terrain at exactly the same moment. No visible communication between them. No orientation toward each other, no pace adjustment in response to the other's movement. Just 2 animals operating with a synchronization so complete it produced no seams, no moments where the relationship between them was visible as a relationship rather than simply a fact. I've filmed animals moving in pairs before, and there is always some individual response visible, some moment where one adjusts and the other follows. This footage had none of that. They had been doing this together long enough that the seams had closed entirely, and the thought of how many corridors it takes to get a method that frictionless is not one I find easy to sit with. The most significant card from the central section wasn't a hunter hit. It was the Eastern Ridge camera from week 10, the last confirmed Bigfoot hit on the grid, the one I had already reviewed. But watching it again after pulling all the central section cards with the full shape of the hunt visible, across the timeline, I saw something I had missed the first time. The Bigfoot came through at just before midnight heading south. Compressed stride, faster cadence, the movement of an animal executing a decision it had already made. What I hadn't registered on the first watch was the direction of its attention. Its head was not oriented forward on the trail. It was angled back over its shoulder, looking north, toward the direction it had come from. toward whatever was behind it. It wasn't just moving away from something, it was moving away from something it was still watching, still tracking the distance between itself and what was gaining on it, even while it was running. I watched that clip 3 times after pulling the central section cards, and the third time was harder than the first. Not because of what the Bigfoot was doing, because of what that backward glance meant about how close the thing behind it already was. 4 hours later, the hunter came back through heading north, same trail, same camera, moving back up through terrain it had already cleared, checking the corridor, confirming the ground it had pushed clean, holding range the way something holds range when it wants whatever it's chasing to keep running and not stop. I sat with that sequence for a long time. The Bigfoot heading south at midnight, the hunter heading north 4 hours later on the same trail. 2 animals in the same corridor, the same frame, moving in opposite directions. One running, one making sure it kept running. That is not 2 animals sharing terrain. That is a hunt in its final stage, and watching it laid out across one card made the whole 8 months of this grid collapse into a single night on a single camera. I didn't fully understand what I had been documenting until that moment. I went back into the field the following night and positioned myself at that camera location, the single point on the grid where both signatures had appeared on the same night. Night vision, fully charged, not calling, not baiting, just placing myself at the convergence point with a camera running, because when footage raises a question that footage alone can't answer, being in the location is the only tool left. Behind a fallen oak on the uphill side of the game trail, clear sightline to the creek crossing below. 3 hours of baseline forest, an owl working the far ridge around midnight, a raccoon briefly at the creek near 1 in the morning. I've logged enough night hours in terrain like this to know what normal sounds like, which is the only reason I can tell you with certainty that what happened at 1:14 in the morning was not a natural lull. The owl stopped mid-call, not at the end of a sequence. Inside 1, cut off, the way sound stops when something has entered an area, and everything smaller has already processed that information and acted on it. There is a silence that means nothing is happening, and a silence that means something is happening, that you can't see yet. The forest shifted from the first to the second in under 3 seconds, and my body understood it before my brain finished catching up. The camera was up before I made a conscious decision to raise it. Movement in the canopy to the north, 80 yards out, large, fast, directional, not wind, the specific movement of something with a fixed heading traveling through the upper story with intention. It lost and reacquired the game trail twice without slowing, an animal running a route it knows from weeks of repeated use. I tracked it in the frame, and I want to be honest about what that experience was. Having this thing in frame, 60 yards of dark forest between us, knowing from 14 cameras and 40 miles of footage exactly what it had been doing in this corridor for 3 weeks. My breathing slowed without me telling it to. Something below conscious thought had already completed its assessment of the situation and was enforcing its conclusions before I had a chance to weigh in. Stay still, stay quiet. Do not give it a reason to know you're here. At 2 minutes it stopped, right at the camera mount I had been pulling cards from all week. It didn't investigate the housing, didn't react to the scent. It stood completely still and looked south, down the corridor, with the stillness of something thinking rather than pausing. Then it moved. Same pace, same heading, south. The forest sounds came back the way they return after something large has made a decision and acted on it. I stayed behind that oak until full light, not because I was unable to move, because everything I've learned across years of doing this agreed that moving was the wrong answer, and I wasn't going to argue with that. Camera 14, creek crossing at the southern terminus of the grid. 2:44 in the morning, 3 nights before I pulled the card, 48 seconds. 2 large animals enter from the north bank and cross heading south. Same build as every hit across there. The entire grid, wide through the shoulders, that low, heavy center of gravity, the purposeful ground covering movement I had been tracking for 40 miles. Consistent spacing maintained through the entire crossing. They adjusted to the current at exactly the same moment. not one following the other's lead, simultaneously, as if the adjustment had been made before they entered the water. They exited on the same stride. I watched those 48 seconds 4 times at the mount, with the creek behind me, and each watch made the coordination more visible, rather than less. Water crossings are where individual decisions become apparent, where an obstacle forces each animal to respond on its own terms, and the gap between two animals becomes readable. These two didn't have a gap. They moved through the crossing the way a single animal moves through familiar terrain. No negotiation, no adjustment, no moment where the relationship between them was visible as a relationship rather than simply a fact. 40 miles and 3 weeks of footage had shown me what they were capable of individually. This clip showed me what they were as a unit, and the unit was something I had no prior reference for. Then I saw the third figure, far bank, tree line, background of the frame, completely still for the entire 48 seconds, which is why I missed it on the first watch, because a stationary shape in a dense tree line at that hour disappears completely if your attention is on two animals crossing in the foreground. But it's there, taller than the two crossing animals, longer limbed, more upright. The proportions I had spent 10 weeks documenting on the eastern ridge before the grid went silent, standing in the tree line on the far bank, watching the two hunters cross the creek below it, not moving toward the water, not retreating into the forest. 48 seconds of complete physical stillness, while the animals that had driven it the full length of this corridor crossed 30 feet below. Not a shift in weight, not a turn of the head. The kind of stillness that takes active, sustained effort to maintain, the kind that has been practiced, that was learned through the specific understanding that any movement at all would be a mistake. And in the final 2 seconds of the clip, it takes one step backward, slow and controlled, the movement of something that has learned through direct experience exactly how much motion is too much. And the tree line closes around it. I pulled up the week 4 card then, a daytime clip I had reviewed for 15 seconds 8 months earlier, logged as inconclusive and filed. A shape in the background on the far bank of a creek crossing in the northern section, something I had read as shadow and moved on from without a second thought. Watching it directly alongside the camera 14 footage, what happened to the timeline I had spent 8 months building took under a minute to complete. That shape is there in week 4, 6 weeks before the first hunter appeared on the eastern cameras, 6 weeks before the Bigfoot activity stopped, 6 weeks before any of it. Watching both clips side by side makes the answer to what that shape is significantly less ambiguous than it was when I filed it. Same stillness, same bank position, same complete absence of movement. It had been in this corridor before the hunters arrived. It had watched them enter from the north. It had spent 8 months and 40 miles learning the one thing the camera 14 footage shows it had learned completely. The two creek crossings aren't the same location, but they sit on the same waterway, the same drainage running the full length of the corridor from north to south. That Bigfoot was at the top of the drainage in week 4. At the bottom of it 8 months later. It had followed the hunters the entire length of this corridor, close enough to watch and far enough back to survive. Pulling from 40 miles of observation, the single rule that the final 2 seconds of the last clip showed, it had learned completely. One step back, slow, controlled, into the tree line. When they cross, you don't move, you don't make a sound. You let them pass and you wait, because you have already watched what this corridor looks like after they come through it. And you know that the only thing standing between you and the same outcome as every other Bigfoot in 40 miles is the discipline to stand completely still and let them go. Monsters hunting Bigfoots across the Appalachian Trail, and one Bigfoot left alive that learned the only rule that kept it that way.